So our third speaker is Zachary Bleemer from Yale School of Management. He'll talk about college major restrictions and student stratification.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you for being here. My name is Zach Bleemer. I'm an economist at Yale. I spend most of my time thinking about allocating students to schools, a question that we've seen a lot of people discuss earlier today. The kind of mechanism that I have in mind is this. This might not be how you've seen it before, but this mechanism is called race-based affirmative action. The way race-based affirmative action works is that students have some combination of SAT scores and high school GPAs that they would typically be admitted under. Those are lined up at the top here. But then students have some sort of social diversity index along the side. That's usually a function of race and class. And you can see that students with a higher social diversity index and a higher SAT score or high school GPA are going to be admitted. This is a policy that was implemented at UC Berkeley in 1995. So I spend most of my time thinking about policies like this. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is not allocating kids to schools, but is actually looking at what's happening once these kids arrive at these schools and allocating kids across majors inside of these universities. So what I'm going to show you now is 3 motivating figures that sort of explain where I'm going to go in this project, and then I'll do my best to lead you through a set of results. So the first figure that's just going to explain why we're interested in the allocation of kids across college majors is this figure. So what we're going to do here is take every college major in the US, index it by the average wages of graduates with those majors, and then what I'm showing you here is the average major premium of graduates by ethnicity and by birth cohort in the US over the last 60 years. So just to be clear, what these lines are capturing is differences in the college majors earned by, in this case, non-URM and URM being defined as Black, Hispanic, and Native American college graduates. And what I want you to take away from this figure is that from the 50 to roughly 1975 birth cohort, there was convergence between these two lines, which is to say Black and Hispanic students were in tendency over time earning majors that had relatively similar, increasingly similar pay to the majors earned by non-URM college graduates. But since about 1980 birth cohort, which are kids who graduated college about 20 years ago, the gap has been rising. I think this is just sort of a new descriptive fact about the US. Over the last 20 years, Black and Hispanic students have been earning relatively lower paying college majors in the US. We're going to be trying to explore why that is. All right, so there's descriptive fact 1. Now let me show you descriptive fact 2. All I'm showing you here is essentially mean wage differences across majors. You might think that those don't capture causal differences. So the fact that Black and Hispanic students are earning lower paying majors might not be a problem if they themselves are going on to high earnings. So my co-author Aashish, Mehta, and I focused in on just a particular case study to try to explore the causal ramifications of switching between higher or lower paid majors. This is a study that focuses on a sort of interesting policy implemented by UC Santa Cruz during the financial crisis, 2008 to 2012. What they did is kids came into the university wanting to study economics. They took Econ 1 and 2 and earned a GPA in those 2 courses. What I'm doing here, if you just start by focusing on the left-hand panel, is just lining kids up by those GPAs from about a 1.5 up until a 4. And then the department implemented a policy. If you don't earn a 2.8 GPA in these 2 classes, then you're not allowed to earn a major in economics. You have to go study something else instead. Now you can see that was imperfectly implemented. There were some students below the threshold, about 40% of kids with a 2.7 were still allowed into the economics major. Here, the x-axis is just, were you an economics major? But there was a pretty substantial jump by about 40 percentage points right at this eligibility threshold, where now these kids right above the threshold, about 80% of them were earning economics majors. And then what we show in an earlier paper is if you link all those same students forward 10 years to their wages when they're actually in the labor market, these are the actual kids' wages, you can see that these above threshold kids are earning much more in their mid to late 20s than students just below the threshold. This is driven by the fact that these students were allowed to be economics majors and these students weren't. The wage gap is very large. For each kid who flips into the economics major, they're earning about $20,000 more, like a 40 or 50% increase in wage relative to if they'd been a sociology or psychology major. Those are the 2 primary majors below the threshold. Those poor souls had to study other social sciences. And it looks like their labor market outcomes look very different. Okay, so that's our takeaway in this earlier paper. What I want you to take away from this figure is shown here in the right-hand panel. What we're doing here is indexing kids by the major premia that I showed you on the previous slide. So in other words, these dots are higher than these dots just because economics majors on average, not these particular kids, but economics majors on average have higher wages. And you can see that the gap in the average wages of the majors earned by these students seems to do a really good job of guessing the actual change in these students' wages, which is to say they're earning majors that pay $20,000 more, and they themselves are earning $20,000 more. It looks like these premia are capturing something real about what happens when you switch students between relatively lower and relatively higher paying majors. All right, so there's descriptive fact 2. Now let me show you a third fact. This is sort of an interesting policy implemented by UC Santa Cruz, where the low GPA students were prohibited from studying economics. What I'm showing you now is the top 25 public universities in the US, as ranked by US News & World Report, and the 5 highest paying majors at those universities, including, I'm guessing, most of the departments that people in this room work in. So you can see we're then filling in this chart with what you had to do in 2002 in order to earn that major at that university. There's a lot of numbers. The numbers are GPA requirements and introductory courses to be allowed into the major. You can see that a lot of majors had these sort of interesting GPA thresholds. There's some A's. A means that you have to fulfill some sort of competitive application. You submit extracurriculars, you submit essays, and the department chooses who is allowed to earn that major. There's a small number of HS's. That means that the kid had to come straight in from high school and be admitted to the major. If they come in as a freshman without having already declared the major, they're prohibited from switching into it. These are the rules as of 2002. I'm going to click forward to show you what the rules look like today. So there's a click forward. Bolded restrictions are numbers that increased, so restrictions that became more binding. Underlined restrictions are new restrictions since 2002. So let me click backwards and forwards one more time. You can see that something like 30% of these majors impose brand new restrictions over the last 20 years, to the point where today about 75 or 80% of these departments have some kind of restriction, primarily GPA restrictions, on access. So there's descriptive fact 3. It looks like at these big public universities, I should note that these universities alone enroll about 10% of all undergraduate students in the United States. They're really big selective schools. And something sort of interesting is happening at these schools. They're becoming increasingly restrictive, in particular in access to lucrative college majors. Okay, so the gist of this paper is to try to connect these 3 sets of results. I'm going to be moving through findings here very quickly, but I hope I'll give you at least a flavor of what we're doing. So I'm going to go through 3 sets of results here. The first set of results is just starting in the big picture. Look at who is earning what majors by ethnicity, by university, by graduation cohort over the last 25 years. And just ask, okay, we know that Black and Hispanic students are relatively flowing into lower paying majors. Is that happening between or within universities? And if it's happening within universities, which universities are driving that trend? So I'm not going to go through a full decomposition here or just run you through the math. I'll just give you a sense of what we find. So we're using data from IPEDS, which conveniently tell us by ethnicity the number of graduates coming out of each university in each major by year back to 1995. And we're trying to decompose this trend up to now. There's this 3 percentage point major premium gap between URM and non-URM graduates into 3 components. The first component in red along the bottom shows is a component that shows that URM students are flowing into universities over time that have relatively lower premium major for all students coming out of those universities. This is well known. Those universities are known as the non-selective publics and for-profit sector, which are schools that tend to offer degrees in relatively lower paying fields. And you can see that about a third of the aggregate national trend in URM students earning relatively lower paying majors can just be explained by URM students over time coming out of universities that provide all of their students with lower paying majors. In the middle term here, you can see there's been essentially no change over time in URM students flowing into more or less stratified universities, which is to say universities where non-URM students earn very different paying majors than URM students. Those bars have hardly changed. If anything, it's shrunk a little bit over time as URM students have moved away from more stratified universities. But then you can see the dominant change in this graph is the growth in those top bars. So what do those top bars mean? Well, they're fixed at 0 in 1995, and then we're asking the universities where URM students are enrolling as of 1995, what's going on in stratification at those universities. And you can see that those universities are becoming much more stratified over time. You can explain about 2/3 of the aggregate growth in stratification just by the fact that the schools that URM students were already at are themselves becoming more stratified. URM students at those schools are earning relatively lower paying majors. All right, so we're going to zoom in on those schools. We show in the paper that the dominant growth in this within university stratification has been driven by selective public universities, which only enroll about 1/3 of URM students, but explain more than half, almost 2/3 of the aggregate growth in within university stratification. So for the rest of the paper, we're now going to zoom in on what's going on at selective public universities that would drive this within university growth in ethnic major stratification. Okay, so part 2, I've already hinted that we think a plausible big picture explanation for this growth in stratification within these selective public universities is their increasing implementation of major restriction policies, especially in lucrative college majors, things like economics and computer science. So what we're going to do is collect a really large, I think pretty interesting data set. We have 4 large public universities student transcripts from the mid-1960s through present. So we have like 60 years of transcripts for these schools. We can link them all forward to things like degree attainment and wages in the labor market. And then we're going to ask, okay, what happens to departments that impose major restrictions? So how are we going to do that? Well, first, just a motivation. What I'm showing you here is the grades, average grade distribution of Black and Hispanic, and then white and Asian, non-URM, students in departments that 3 years in the future of this graph are going to impose major restrictions. These 4 universities imposed 26 major restriction policies over the 60 years that we can observe them. And you can see that URM students earn about 3 z-scores, or sorry, 0.3 z-scores, so like 0.3 standard deviations lower grades on average in those departments' introductory courses than non-URM students. So you would expect that GPA restrictions are going to differentially affect access for URM students. All right, so how are we going to actually measure that? This is a pretty standard event study design. What I'm going to be showing you is what happens when these 26 departments impose major restriction policies at some t = 0. There's sort of an inconvenience here, which is that we have imperfect measurement of when the major restriction policies began. And so I'll show you sort of a window where we know that these policies began at some point in the window, but we're not quite sure which cohort was the first one impacted. This is because of grandfathering. But I think that'll become clearest if I just show you some graphs. So what's going on here? We're showing you what happens in majors that impose major restrictions relative to other majors at those universities and relative to other majors that are similar at other universities. So the first outcome here is just how many students earn these majors. And you can see that in the years leading up to major restriction policies implementation, these departments are growing. That's part of what motivates the implementation of major restrictions. The majors are growing up until some point when the major restrictions are implemented, and then they shrink back down to their initial level 5 or 6 years before restrictions implementation, which is to say these restrictions are binding, and you sort of end up around 20 or 30% smaller than your peak enrollment right when the restriction is imposed. Oh, that means that some students are being excluded from restricted majors on average. Which students are those? Well, after you impose a restriction, the average SAT scores of kids in your major rises. Here we're just indexing students' academic performance by a 2-way fixed effect decomposition of grades into student and course fixed effects. All that's, I think, relevant here is that the kids who get into restricted majors tend to do better in school than the kids who had previously been earning this major before the restrictions implementation. Of course, this is just by construction, right? The whole idea was to push kids out with relatively low grades. Which kids are those? You can see that Black and Hispanic enrollment in these departments falls by between 2 and 3 percentage points after restrictions implementation. That's from a base of 11%. So this is like a 20 to 30% decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment. You can see that the average income of the zip codes that these kids came from, which is a proxy for family income, rises by about 5% on average in departments that have imposed these GPA restrictions. We then do a lot of work in the paper to understand the potential efficiency gains of these policies. So maybe you think these policies are letting in kids with comparative advantages in the field. Maybe you think that by pushing low GPA students out, you're improving the educational experience of the students who remain. Maybe you think that by pushing low GPA students out, you're helping them make it through college instead of allowing them into a field where they'll have a difficult time. All 3 of those stories are false. I'm not going to go through them now, though I'm happy to talk more in the questions. Okay, so in the last 2 minutes here, I just want to give you a quick sense of, okay, we know that Black and Hispanic students are being differentially pushed out of restrictions, but we haven't yet connected that to aggregate stratification. What majors are those kids earning instead? And to what degree can you explain aggregate stratification's growth by Black and Hispanic students flowing into lower paying majors because of major restrictions implementation? Okay, so to do that, we're going to need some new tools. So the paper develops what you might think of as a predicted intention diff and diff design. So the idea here is that we're going to use a training sample of students from 4 or 5 years before restrictions implementation. We're going to use their freshman fall courses to figure out who wants to earn, say, a computer science major just on the basis of their initial course taking. We're going to then follow those kids over time relative to kids who don't want to earn, say, a computer science major, and see how their majors change when computer science imposes a restriction policy. All right, so you might have a bunch of questions about, for example, do kids' freshman fall courses change when a restriction policy is imposed? The answer, let me see if I have the slide here, is no, or at least not differentially by ethnicity. So this is just the change in average intention of students over time. You can see there's a slight decrease, but it's not the case that it's driven by URM students. There's no differential discouragement of URM students into taking introductory courses in fields that impose restrictions. So it must just be that the kids are still taking those courses, but they're being pushed out by the restrictions implementation. I'll just have a side note here that it turns out that this discouragement effect is wholly driven by women. There's no effect on men. That's something we look at in some other work. So given the fact that there aren't there's no differential discouragement by ethnicity, what can we learn about the kids who intended majors that became restricted? So what I'm doing here is showing you the average premium of the majors earned by kids with high intention in restricted majors. And then this is the differential effect on the average premium earned by high intention kids by ethnicity. You can see there's nothing happening on the left. On average, kids who get pushed out of restricted majors end up earning majors with relatively similar premia. But that's not the case for Black and Hispanic students. Relative to non-URM students, URM students get pushed into much lower paying majors to the degree that they have increased intentions of earning these restricted fields. So, okay, so the last thing we're going to do is take these numbers, the fact that major restrictions, both because they differentially push URM students out and because there's some evidence that URM students choose relatively lower premia counterfactual or second choice majors after losing access to the restricted major. We're going to follow those students along and see to what degree you can explain the growth in aggregate stratification just by this decline in the average relative premium earned by URM students. I'm going to skip again the math there because I actually think the figure is pretty easy to understand. We're going to fix things at 0 in 1995. The dots are the actual aggregate relative stratification at these 4 University of California campuses. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that those 4 campuses are Berkeley, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Davis. So at those 4 campuses, relative to the average differential major premium earned by URM and non-URM students in 1995, you can see that the average premium has been growing over time. In fact, those are in dots. And then all we're doing in the line is each time one of those campuses imposes a new restriction, the line increases by the degree to which we would expect that restriction to drive stratification. So you can see that from 1995 until the financial crisis, the line seems to be doing a pretty good job of explaining when stratification rises. A new restriction is imposed, the line rises, and indeed those campuses seem to become more stratified. You can also see that since the financial crisis, these universities have become stratified much faster than can be explained just by the imposition of new restrictions. We think there's at least 2 things going on here. One is that during the financial crisis, these campuses ratcheted up restrictions that already existed, which is something that we're not accounting for here. So departments that hadn't been taking the restriction very seriously started taking it very seriously. This is especially true in economics and computer science departments that became very popular around this time. A second thing that's happening is that these universities experienced a very large influx of international students who were crowding out URM students from relatively lucrative majors. Though that crowd out is in part driven by these restriction policies, right? The reason that international students can crowd out, at least to some degree, relatively less prepared domestic students, is that those domestic students were pushed out of the major by these access restrictions. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. What I hope you've taken away from this is that it looks like US universities are becoming increasingly within university stratified over time. in a manner that's very strongly correlated with income. And we think that these major restriction policies are playing a really important role in driving this national trend. Thanks very much.
Maybe take one quick question. Yeah, for the rest of questions, definitely continue the discussion offline.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. What could diversity policies within a university do to dampen this? Have you simulated that or looked into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a lot of potential policy alternatives to major restriction policies. One thing to point out is that while these policies are extremely popular at public universities, they're almost unheard of at private universities. So if I showed you that same table, top 25 schools for private universities, only 5 to 10% of these majors have any kind of restriction. So there's a sense in which the immediate counterfactual is to just let more students into these majors. Then there are a number of possible ways of doing that. This could mean increasing class sizes. This could mean hiring either tenure track or adjunct faculty. The paper goes through a number of possible alternatives, though I don't think we have a very clear example of explanation for what ought to be done, so much as just to explain that what universities are doing right now is, despite the fact that it's being implemented separately at hundreds of different universities, is driving this easily measurable national aggregate trend.
Zach, again for